Book of Isaiah, chapter 7. The sign of Emmanuel. When Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. Now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, Go out, you and your son Sherab-Jeshub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool, on the road to the launderer's field. Say to him, Be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram, of the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, Let us invade Judah. Let us tear it apart and divide it amongst ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says. It will not take place. It will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. Again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or the highest heights. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Then Isaiah said, Hear now, you house of David. It is not enough to try the patience of humans. Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. The Lord will bring on you and your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. In that day the Lord will whistle for flies from the Nile Delta in Egypt, and for the bees from the land of Assyria. They will all come and settle in the steep ravines, in the crevices in the rocks, and on the thorn bushes, and at all the water holes. In that day the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria, to shave your head in private parts, and to cut off your beard also. In that day a person will keep alive a young cow and 2 goats, and because of the abundance of the milk they give, there will be curds to eat, and all who remain in the land will eat curds and honey. In that day, every place where there were 1,000 vines worth 1,000 silver shekels, there will be only briars and thorns. Hunters will go there with bow and arrow, for the land will be covered with briars and thorns. As for all the hills once cultivated by the hoe, you will no longer go there for fear of the briars and thorns. They will become places where cattle are turned loose and where sheep run. Okay, let's look at the verse by verse here. This is the first time we hear the name Emmanuel. Emmanuel in Hebrew, it means God is God with us. Just in case you were curious on that. 7:1 through 39. Trust, the basis of servanthood. Well, it's trust, the basis of servanthood. If the nation of unclean lips could have the same experience as the man of unclean lips, Then they could hear Yahweh's message to the nations just as Isaiah did to them. Like Isaiah, they need to truly perceive Yahweh's holiness, power, and reliability, bringing them to a place where they will trust Him rather than humanity's illusory power and glory. So this major division of the book is united around the question of divine versus human trustworthiness. Chapters 7 through 12 and 36 through 39 provide a contrasting bookends. King Ahaz of Judah refuses to trust in Yahweh, but his son King Hezekiah does trust Yahweh in a far more serious situation than his father had faced. Chapters 13 through 35 show why Ahaz's decision was wrong and provide a basis for Hezekiah's right decision. Verses 1 through 12:6, Ahaz's refusal to trust. This section has 4 parts. 7:1 through chapter 9:7 deals with Ahaz's bad decision and his immediate implications. The remaining 3 parts, 9:8 through 10:4, 10:5 through 11:16, 12:1 through 6, explore the deeper causes of what was happening and the ultimate solution to the problem. Through it all is an underlying issue: who is the real king and the nation's ultimate hope? 7:1 through 9:7, signs of the promise. Yahweh declares his faithfulness to King Ahaz through Isaiah. He demonstrates this with a series of signs. The ultimate sign and proof is the child, Emmanuel. Verses 1 through 25 are the sign and the consequences of its rejection. Yahweh gave Isaiah a message for Ahaz. Ahaz could trust Yahweh to protect him from his enemies in verses 1 through 9. God offered him a sign to confirm the promise, but Ahaz, having already determined to trust Assyria, rejected the sign. Isaiah gave the sign anyway, indicating that its immediate significance would be that the nation would shortly be all but destroyed. In verses 13 through 25. 7:1 through 2, Judah pressured to join coalition against Assyria. The Assyrian Empire, after about 50 years of relative quiescence, was pushing aggressively southward towards Egypt. The 2 smaller nations, north of Judah, Aram and Israel, were trying to compel Judah to join them in a coalition against Assyria. They threatened to depose Ahaz if he refused. 7:1, the word Aram, which is Syria, and Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, also identified as Ephraim. 7:2, the words house of David probably refers not only to Ahaz, a member of the Davidic dynasty, but also to the entire royal family of that time. The word Ephraim, the main northern tribe, and thus another name for the northern kingdom of Israel. In verses 3 through 9, a challenge to trust Yahweh. Ahaz had already made arrangements to send a large sum of money to the Assyrian Empire to attack Aram, which is Syria, and Israel, something the emperor was planning to do anyway. You can see another reference to that in 2 Kings 16:7 through 9. 7:3, Sher-Jashub, as we heard before, that's the name of Isaiah's son. A judgment on Ahaz's foolish plan, see note on 7:4, smoldering stubs of firewood. The 2 enemy kings have no real power to do anything. The words son of Remaliah contemptuously refer to Pekah, king of Israel, also in verses 5 and 9. He was a usurper, and his father was a nobody. In verses 3 through 9, or 5 through 9, it does not matter what the 2 kings might be saying. It is what the sovereign Lord says that counts. If he says that the threats will come to nothing, that is how it will be. In verse 8, the words 65 years. It is not clear what this event refers to. It's probable that the encounter between Isaiah and Ahaz took place in 734 BC. The fall of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, occurred in 722 BC. Possibly this reference is to the settlement in Israel of the foreign colonists who were through intermarriage with the remaining Israelites to become the later Samaritans. In verse 9, the word stand firm, stand. It's another word play. The same word is used when Ahaz must do and what God would do. Ahaz must be firm in his faith if God would make him firm in the face of the enemy. In verses 10 through 23, the rejection of the sign. Since Ahaz already decided to rely on Assyria, he did not welcome any confirmation that such reliance was not only unnecessary but wrong. Although Ahaz tries to cover his unbelief with hypocritical piety, Isaiah sees through it and gives the sign anyway. The sign's significance is twofold. One, its immediate portent is quite negative. The Assyria Ahaz trusted would turn on him and threaten the nation far more seriously than Pekah or Rezin ever could. And two, but there is a positive sense as well, which 9:1 through 7 and 11:1 through 16 further expand upon. In verses 10 through 17, the sign of Emmanuel. Isaiah offers Ahaz a sign of immense significance. The deepest depths of hell, the highest heights of heaven, that will prove God's saving presence with his people. Ahaz attempts to refuse it, but Isaiah gives it anyway. It's a sign full of mystery with the portents of near-term judgment and long-term salvation caught up in it. In 12, the words put the Lord to the test, disbelief in his promises. See another reference in Exodus 17:2 and 7. In verse 14, the word virgin, Hebrew word is Emma, which means young woman of marriageable age. In Israelite society, a young woman of marriageable age would have been a virgin, as the Septuagint, the pre-Christian Greek translation of the Old Testament, makes plain. Otherwise, she would have been a prostitute. But the Hebrew word is not the technical term meaning virgin. Isaiah uses this more ambiguous term because of the double reference of this sign. In its immediate reference, the virginity of the mother is not the most significant point. Rather, God is saying that before a child conceived at that time would reach an age 12 or 13, the two nations of which Ahaz was so terrified would cease to exist. But in the long term, this sign, higher than heaven and deeper than hell, referred to the coming of Jesus Christ, the true Emmanuel. And the virginity of his mother was vitally important. That is why Isaiah did not use a simple word meaning woman or young woman. The word Emmanuel means God with us. The Bible emphasizes the importance of God being with his people. God would be with his people to defend them from their enemies if they would stand with him in faith. But this is more than a figure of speech. In Jesus, it had become a fact. God has become a human being and with us in every respect except one. He has not committed sin. And we see another reference to that in Hebrews 4:15. In verses 15 through 17, before the child conceived by the young woman would become 12 or 13 years old, it would reject the wrong in verses 15 and 16. Both Syria and Israel would be laid waste by Assyria, but because Ahaz's faithfulness, Judah would feel the lash as well in verse 17. In 15, the words curd and honey, it's a figure of speech for rich food. The land would be so depopulated that those who remained would have an abundance of food to eat. In 18 through 25, the coming of Assyrian attack. In his typical fashion, Isaiah emphasizes his point with a graphic illustration. He pictures the enemies in their multitudes as flies and bees, verses 18 and 19. He pictures Assyria as a razor disgracing the men of Israel by shaving off all of their body hair, in verse 20. He depicts the depopulation of the land, providing the few who remain with the amounts and kinds of food the nobility would usually and typically eat. Verses 21 through 22. But at the same time, with only a handful of people left, the arable land would grow only briars and thorns. Verses 23 and 25. Perhaps a reference to the situation in 701 BC when Sennacherib ravaged the land. And taking a real quick look at both of the Wycliffe and Matthew Henry commentary. We'll do Matthew Henry first. Matthew Henry breaks this down into 4 parts. First one is Ahaz's consternation, verses 1-2. Number 2, the assurance that God by the prophet sent him, verses 3 through 9. 3, the confirmation of this by a sign, verses 10 through 16. And 4, a threat of the great desolation that God would bring on Ahaz, verses 17 through 25. Ahaz is threatened by Israel and Assyria, and is assured their attack will be in vain, verses 1 through 9. God gives us a sure sign by the promise of the long-expected Messiah, 10 through 16. The folly and sin of seeking relief from Assyria are reproved in 17 through 25. Verses 1 through 9. Ungodly men are often punished by others as bad as themselves. Being in great distress and confusion, the Jews gave up all for lost. They had made God their enemy, and knew not how to make him their friend. The prophet must teach them to despise their enemies in faith and dependence on God. Ahaz, in fear, called them 2 powerful princes. No, says the prophet, they are but tails of smoking firebrands. Burnt out already, the 2 kingdoms of Syria and Israel were nearly expiring. While God has work for the firebrands of the earth, they consume all before them. But when their work is fulfilled, they will become extinguished in smoke. That which Ahaz thought most formidable is made the ground of their defeat, because they have taken evil counsel against thee, which is an offense to God. God scorns the scorners and gives his word that the attempt should not succeed. Man proposes, but God disposes. It was folly for those to be trying to ruin their neighbors who were themselves near to ruin. Isaiah must urge the Jews to rely on the assurances given them. Faith is absolutely necessary to quiet and compose the mind in trials and tribulations. In verses 10 through 16, secret disaffection to God is often disguised with the color of respect to him, and those who are resolved that they will not trust God, yet pretend they will not tempt him. The prophet reproved Ahaz and his court for the little value they had for divine revelation. Nothing is more grievous to God than distrust, but the unbelief of man shall not make the promise of God of no effect. The Lord himself shall give a sign. How great soever your distress and danger of you the Messiah is to be borne, and you cannot be destroyed while that blessing is in you. It shall be brought to pass in a glorious manner, and the strongest consolations of time and trouble are derived from Christ. Our relation to him, our interest in him, our expectations of him and from him. He would grow up like other children by the use of the diet of those countries, but he would, unlike other children, uniformly refuse the evil and choose good. And although his birth would be by the power of the Holy Ghost, yet he should not be fed with angels' food. Then follow a sign of the speedy destruction of the princes, now a terror to Judah. Before this child, so it may be read that this child, which I have now in my arms, Shear-Jashub, the prophet's own son, in verse 3, shall be 3 or 4 years older. The enemies shall be forsaken of both their kings. The prophecy is so solemn, the sign is so marked as given by God himself after Ahaz rejected the offer, that it must have raised hopes far beyond what the present occasion suggested. And if the prospect of the coming of the divine Savior was a never-failing support to the hopes of any ancient believers, what cause have we to be thankful that the Word was made flesh? May we trust in and love him and copy his example. 17 through 25. Let those who will not believe the promises of God expect to hear the alarms of his threatenings, for who can resist or escape his judgments? The Lord shall sweep all away, and whoever he employs in any service for him, he will pay. All speaks a sad change of the face of that pleasant land. But what melancholy change is there? Which sin will not make with a people? Agriculture would cease. Sorrows of every kind will come upon all who neglect the great salvation. If we remain unfruitful under the means of grace, the Lord will say, "Let no fruit grow on thee henceforth forever." And in the Wycliffe, Emmanuel rejected by worldly wisdom, 1 through 25. A God's people confronted by peril, verses 1 and 2. Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel had formed an alliance against the menace of a revived Assyrian empire and were determined to bring Judah into their coalition, even though it meant deposing Ahaz and substituting a puppet king, the son of Tabeel. Marshalling their armies for the successful invasions recorded in 2 Chronicles 28, they sent a shiver of fear through the outnumbered forces of Judah, captained by their ungodly king. In part 2, God's promise of deliverance, 3 through 9, Ahaz inspected the city's water supply in preparation for the siege that was to come. Probable date given here of 735 BC. God revealed to the prophet that the precise thoughts running through their king's mind, and bade him go to meet Ahaz, taking along young Sher-Jeshub, presumably because of the gracious promise contained in his name, "A remnant shall return" from captivity. Without prior mention of the king's unannounced sins, God, through Israel, first conveyed to him a promise of practical deliverance, treating him with kindness, altogether undeserved. Within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken in pieces, that is, by 669 BC, reckoning from 735, of course. Actually, Samaria fell within 11 years, 722 BC approximately, and her population was deported beyond Assyria. But the settling of non-Israelite colonists by the government apparently did not take place on a large scale until the reign of Ashur-bani-pal, 669 through 626, a fact alluded to in Ezra 4 through 10, where the immigrants refer to the king of Assyria as a snapper or Osnapper. With foreign influx, the northern kingdom was truly broken in pieces ethnically, and the sparse native Israelites still left in the land were submerged. A threat in Pekah implied here, though not made explicit. Note that the Jews had yet to receive and rest upon the divine promise if they were to be established, i.e., derive practical benefit from this judgment visited upon the northern allies. Their failure to do so led to the worsening of their plight as they become subject to Assyria. Part 3, God's promise spurned by unbelief. The Lord offered a confirmatory miracle to bolster Ahaz's faith, inviting him to name it. It could be anything, from heaven above to earth beneath. But Ahaz, having made up his mind to put his trust in Assyria, put Isaiah off with a hypocritical pious pretext alluding to general prohibition of Deuteronomy 6:16. God's deliverance reaffirmed his delivered promise in 13 through 25. A virgin shall conceive. The word for virgin here is carefully chosen, as we first talked about that first commentary. Etymologically, Alma does not necessarily signify a virgin, an untouched maiden. In actual usage in the Hebrew scriptures, however, it refers only to a maiden chaste and unmarried, so far as the context shows. This well fits the prospective mother alluded to in this situation. Judging from chapter 8, 1-4, the typical mother was the prophetess, who became Isaiah's wife within a short time after the prophecy was spoken. Therefore, she was a virgin at the time of this promise was given. She serves as a type of the virgin, who remained a virgin even after her miraculous conception by the Holy Spirit. The son of this prophetess, accordingly, is a type of the messianic Emmanuel, as will shortly be explained. The words butter and honey was the standard diet of those who lived in a devastated land that had reverted to pasturage. Such a diet the son of a prophetess was to eat as the result of the coming Assyrian departedness, as well as those neighboring nations. That he may know, the words that he may know, the Hebrew can signify either. That is, when he attains the age of legal accountability, doubtless 12 years of age. This would come out to 721 BC, after the destructive campaigns of Shalmaneser V and Sargon. Certainly by 721 Damascus was forsaken, having been captured by Assyria in 732 BC, and likewise Samaria, which fell in 722. Jehovah will bring upon Ahaz and his people, because they refused to trust him, the king of Assyria, i.e. the unparalleled oppression and tyranny of the Assyrian Empire. The coming punishment of Judah is more fully described in the remainder of this chapter. 18. The words the fly of Egypt and the bee of Assyria. A warning of the clash of armies, notably of El-Tekiah in 701 between rival powers of Egypt and Assyria. Their troops undoubtedly stripped the whole countryside of Judah for provisions and supplies. The razor that is hired. The future king of Sennacherib, who leveled most of Judah to the ground in 701, destroying 46 cities according to his own account, and leading captive some 200,000 people. The Assyrians were hired in the sense that they were first bribed by Ahaz to intervene in the west. You see another example of that in 2 Chronicles 28:21. Here again we find butter and honey as the food of sparse survivors in a land ruined, fields and orchards desolated. Naturally, in such areas the value of real estate would drop to nothing, and fields would revert to young forests in which wild animals might be hunted or cattle might range.